Yeah.
And this was new paradigm was going to work. Well, yeah, it's just that it was 70 years since the last collapse, and we just all forgot about it. We didn't live the history,
right.
so we don't think it's true.
And those people died, and now we're here.
Yeah, now
So
we're
it's,
here.
it's new for us.
We make a new mistake all over.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, you bet. Good morning. Hello. I'll give you a little handout here. Good morning. Hi, Lois. Handout. Give it to you guys. Good morning. Maybe a couple here. I can hand them on down there. All right. I got plenty of them. Good morning. There's a handout. Good morning. There you go. Hi, everybody. Well, good. Glad to see you guys. Yeah. Hi, Jerry. Even got one for you. Do they normally do that? I don't think they usually do.
Sometimes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do they normally shut the doors, though, during the classes? Yeah. I think I'll probably do that. Boy. Whoa! Oh my gosh, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
I haven't seen you for a coon's age.
Yeah, I know, it's been a while.
Well, what grade are you in now?
I'm a junior.
Oh, gosh. Oh, that's right. You're the same as our grandson Gus, I think. Super. Well, good to see you. I got to teach a class in here right now,
Yeah,
but I'll catch you later.
I'll be running AV for you.
Oh, you're going to?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to turn my volume up.
Yeah.
All right. Do you know if we can get that to focus any better than that? Maybe we just have to move this up a little bit.
Oh man, I don't know how to do it, but Liam does.
Yeah, I guess that's
Farther
maybe.
away,
It is farther away. I think it makes it worse, doesn't it?
no, it makes it bigger.
It's bigger, but it's not very
I see, now it's
focused very
clear.
clearly.
There's a way to do it. I don't know how to do it. I can go get Liam quick, but I just need to check your battery.
Oh, okay.
That's your cataracts out.
Yeah, right. No, mine are fixed. That's on? Okay. A handout here. Hi, thank you. Good morning. Here's the handout. Well, we better get started here. I think I'm going to have somebody kind of cue me in as to when we get near the end of the time here, because I don't have my watch with me. I'm not going to be looking at my phone all the time. Oh, good. All right. That'll help, unless I get lost in what I'm saying. Well, in case you don't know me, I'm Al Freeland. My wife Sonia and I have been members here since 1995, and we have 2 sons and 5 grandkids. And I've been an engineer most of my life, as well as a realtor for a good chunk of it. But I flipped my license full-time as in real estate when I retired in 2018. Yeah, but it's just a little bit out of focus. I didn't know if it would. I don't know if there's any focus on this thing or not. It's a little better.
Totally 100% true.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe people can see. This isn't a focus here, is it? Oh, there we go. There we go. That's good enough. That sounds great. Before we started, I want to give you a little bit of background why I wanted to teach this class. It was, I grew up in a small Norwegian community down in Iowa, and about the only thing that was available for any kids to do at that time was 4-H or FFA or confirmation, your church activities, and Boy Scouts. That was about all we had to do. And church was a big bulk of things that we did. And as I grew up, we have, of course, our Sunday activities and Lenten activities. We're very rigorous going to church. And we all grew up in, the old Bible was the Word of God, and and we were preached it and taught it, and we studied it in confirmation and Luther League, and it was a big part of our life. Well, as a teenager, as we probably all did, I'm sure, we ended up getting a little bit disenfranchised with our faith and the pastor and our teachers, Sunday school teachers, and at least my own personal story was I would always argue with them and about things I've read in the Bible, and all kids do that. And still, for me, I think a big change happened when I was 13 years old. I went to a Lenten service, and there was a minister or a missionary from Madagascar that was at our church giving that Lenten service, and he told about his missionary work in Madagascar. I think for me that was probably the old, some people would call it conversion, or time you dedicate your life to Christ. And for me, it really was a big impact on my life, what he told us and what he had gone through in the mission field. And so from that time on, I really felt like maybe some kind of ministry work was something that I wanted to get into. As I went into college at Iowa State in Ames, Iowa, I took my minors were philosophy and European history, and I took all the religion classes I could, Old Testament, New Testament, and it pretty much took me away from my faith. I kind of fell into this is a really good book, and here's good history, and let's go through the history of it, but I didn't see it no longer as the Word of God. And I was working at the time at the Highway Commission in Ames, working my way through college, and there was a gentleman that worked with me. His name was Gary, and Gary was an active member in the Navigators. And I don't know if any of you have heard of the Navigators before, but they're actually active in Northfield right now. Navigators were basically trying to spread the word of the Lord to the young students on campus. And so I was spouting off to Gary all my smartness, about after my New Testament and Old Testament classes, how, boy, the Bible's a good book, don't tell me about it being the Word of God. And he stopped me, and it's probably the one thing that I can say changed my entire life, was his question to me. He said, Al, have you read the Bible? And I was kind of stuttered and stammered, and I said, well, I've read parts, and he said, I tell you what, until you can tell me you read the Bible from the beginning to the end, cover to cover, when you do that, then I'll listen to your criticism of the Bible. You can't criticize it if you haven't read it. And so I was so mad. I took this same Bible, and I took it in between every class and into boring classes, and every second I had, and I read it from Genesis to Revelations. And I can honestly tell you that after I finished reading it, that God had me. I knew that it wasn't just a normal book. It was something that a little bit more than just that. So this class is about how we got our Bible. And it's been a subject that's always been a passion for me. I just love the history of how this all happened, how we got this thing, and is it really God's Word, and how did it get written, and where are the manuscripts at? So my intent today is to go through not only the overall history and timeline of how it happened, but also then go into details about the manuscripts and how they migrated into the thing that we have today as far as we call the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament. In my life, I've challenged myself. I've read the Bible 32 times. I've read it in 4 different languages. I'm currently going to be, I have been for the last 2 years, been active in a proofreading of a new revision of the Bible that's going to be put out. In fact, it's out in PDF right now, and it'll be printed and it can be ordered this month. but I'll be talking about that next Sunday. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life of it. But the thing that I like to talk about in order to put everything into perspective is a timeline. I do this because I've taught Sunday school for decades, and I always put everything into a timeline. Because for me, the only way I can make sense of all this, and I know, Jerry, you really know a lot of history stuff, and in order for me to make kind of sense of all this historical stuff, I got to put it in a simple timeline. So a lot of the things I'm going to be telling you, I want you to take, not with a grain of salt, but just keep this thought in mind, that my timelines and my dates won't always be exact, because I wanted to put it into an understandable overall view. So you can argue with me all you want about that date isn't really 400 BC, it's 423. Don't bother doing that, because I know that I've rounded up a lot of my numbers. So what I wanted to start with, and I did give you a handout, and if everybody didn't get one, I don't think you did. And anybody else that didn't get one? Yep, I'll give you one here. Not 7 of them. Okay. There you go. And there's one there. Okay. And the outline of history, and we're going to say, what in the world does this have to do with the Bible? But it does kind of all flow together when you listen to me. So at 8,000 years ago, 8,000 BC, and I will be using BC and AD instead of those other things that they come up with. It's BC is before Christ, and AD is Anno Domini, Latin for in the year of our Lord. So it'll be BC and AD. So at 8,000 BC, a really unusual event took place, or was actually, you'd be standing at this very point, and it'd be something very unusual. You'd be standing underneath a mountain of ice called a glacier that would be about a mile thick right here in Northfield. And that would be 8,000 BC, just to put things into perspective. And as the glacier started melting, to your point, I think we talked a little bit earlier, when the glacier started melting around the world, a lot of the runoff could very well have been what you would consider the flood stories. Noah's flood stories. It's a universal story throughout the world in old cultures about this flood. And so that might have been the flood story at that time. 2000 BC, we're going to fast forward many thousands of years, and around 2000 is Abraham. Abraham is the father of our faith. It had not only a time of Abraham's origin, but also it happened to be about the same time that the Hindus and Hinduism started. So I'm going to be highlighting a couple different areas in here of areas that have other religions as well as just the Christian religion. So we have 2000 BC, we have Abraham. Abraham, of course, had his son Isaac, and Isaac had his son Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons, and one of those, of course, was Joseph, who was sold into slavery to Egypt. Big famine happened, and all of the Jewish, let's call them the Jewish or the Hebrew folks of the family of Jacob, all of those went to Egypt because, of course, there was food there, and you know all those stories. I'm not going to go into those details. We're going to fast forward 500 years. Now we come to the people that were in Egypt grew to a large flock of the Hebrews, and Moses led them back to the Promised Land, back to Israel, back to the land that they originally came from. Moses is purported to have written the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There's all kinds of different people talking about different editors, the JEPD editors that contributed to or moved things around. But if you're Norwegian, you'd look at the Norwegian Bible, and it would be Første Mosebok, Annen Mosebok. It would be the first book of Moses, the second book of Moses. So they call, instead of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, I think it's the same in German too. It'd be the first book of Moses, the second book of Moses. So it's the church has said that a good part of that was probably written by Moses, and also at that time when they eventually got into the promised land, of course, there's judges that arose to lead and guide all of these Israelites that were now the nation of Israel. And Joshua is believed as one of the first judge, was believed to have written some of the history of the trip and the travels and the first leadership of the Israelis. Then we're going to flip ahead, and there's a whole series of judges, and then you come to 1000 BC. And 1000 BC sees Saul as the first king that was chosen. They no longer wanted to have judges. And so you've got this nation of Israel, and now you got the first king of Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. Well, how this deals now with the Bible is, as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of oral traditions before Moses, and then Moses started writing down his first 5 books of the Bible. At the time of Abraham, the book of Job probably was written. It was the oldest book in the Bible. So Job was probably there. And now you've got time of David and Solomon. David wrote a lot of the Psalms. Solomon wrote some of the Psalms, probably the Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes. And those books at the time of David were all collected by the priestly set. So you've got some of the books of the Bible that are starting at this particular time. The thing that always kind of confused me a bit, if you remember, now the Israelites are all in the country of Israel. After Solomon, the country was split in half. They split to the north part, which was called Israel, of the country of Israel. They called themselves Israel. Capital was in Samaria. And the southern part was Judah. Capital was in Jerusalem. An interesting thing happened at around the 700-year BC era was that the northern part was taken into captivity and had battles with Assyria, and the Assyrians took the majority of the northern part of the kingdom into captivity. And they backfilled all of the people that were taken into captivity to Assyria with Assyrians into the northern part of Israel. And so you've got a mixture now of pagan faith of the Assyrians mixed together with the Jewish faith that was in place in the northern kingdom. And that was an aborted type of, really a weird mixture of the two religions. And the people that were in that area were called Samaritans back then, in 700 BC, as well as in Jesus' time. So that's where the Samaritan idea came from. Now, there were many prophets that were writing, trying to guide the people, make sure that they come back to the true faith. When you fast forward now to 500 years before Christ, a lot of things really happened in 500. The Babylonians captured the southern portion in Judah, and they exiled them to Babylonia, which is today's Iraq. But they ended up coming back. So the pure Jews still ended up coming back later, 70 years later. But they were taken into captivity, and some stayed in Babylonia. Some were still in Assyria. And in 500 BC, a lot of prophets, major and minor prophets, were writing and trying to keep the people on track to the Word of God as written in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible. That was their holy books. And the prophets would write these and send them, and the letters would be read around, and those letters then were all accumulated. And at 500 BC, there was a man by the name of Ezra who was a priest. And it's the best construct on this, that Ezra, at that time, 500 BC, accumulated all the books of Moses and the Psalms and all of Solomon's writings, the Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, all the Proverbs, all the writings of the minor and major prophets, and Ezra gathered these all together into the same 39 books that we have in our Old Testament today. And these were all written in Hebrew and a little bit of it in Aramaic, which is the common language, but it was still similarly structured to Hebrew. So these were written in Hebrew with a little bit of Aramaic. Now we go to 300 BC. So a couple hundred years, you've got Samaritans on top, and you got the Jews in the bottom, and you got all the holy books written together 500 years before Christ, all as we have them today. If you remember, a lot of these people were in exile, and it so happened at 300 BC that a lot of the countries were Greek. The Greek, Alexander had taken over much of the area, and the Greek became the lingua franca of the day. They were able to only understand. They forgot their native language of Hebrew, and there was 72 scribes that got together and met in 300 BC and said, we've got to translate these 39 books into Greek in order to have the holy word of the Lord given to the rest of our people that are no longer in Israel, that are in fact were exiled. And so this was a monumental thing that took place. All of a sudden now we've got the 72 people met. There was 6 chosen from all of the 12 tribes that were the scholars. They met together, and in 72 days, ironically, this is history, but yet it's not exactly verified. The tradition says there were 72 scribes met, 6 from each tribe, and in 72 days they had translated all 39 books from Hebrew, a little of Aramaic, into Greek. The Septuagint was a classic writing. We still have copies of these, or fragments of these are still in existence. So that became the Bible. They had the Hebrew for the people in Israel. They were servicing all of the Greek-speaking folks throughout the area in Samaria and wherever the Jews had left and were exiled to. So for 300 years, up into 0, when Jesus was born. Now, it's kind of interesting to think that Jesus, he went to bar mitzvah. He went, like our confirmation in the Jewish faith. He was bar mitzvahed, and his Old Testament that he would read from would be on scrolls, and he was reading from the same Bible that we have today, the Old Testament. That was his Bible, was the Old Testament. He also spoke Aramaic, because that was a common language at those days for the common folks, was Aramaic. And as well as he understood Greek, because Greek was a lingua franca for all that area there. Paul wrote in Greek. All the letters, all the early Gospels and the letters were all written in Greek. So, Jesus was born, and I put in there 4 BC to 0 because it's kind of flops as to where he actually was born, what time he was born. There's many reasons for that. I won't get into that. But he was, when Jesus born, died, resurrected, when he was in 30 AD, ascended to heaven, and the church grew like crazy. The book of Acts Luke documented how the church grew and spread, and Paul's missionary activities throughout the world. And all the missionary activities, I just read a great book on this, how Paul had planted all of these churches throughout the area, and very dangerous voyages that he took to do it. And he started little churches around, and of course people adored him. He was a brilliant Jew that was a great speaker, great logician, and he would write letters then to all of the different churches, and that was his pastoral letters, and he wrote letters. There was also other documents that were written by John, Peter, Jude. All of these folks were writing letters, and those were gathered, and those all took place about the first 100 years. So you have a whole flurry from 30 after Christ rose from the dead up into 100 AD, when all these letters were finally slowly gathered together. Skip over to 300 AD. By this time, all the books that we call our New Testament were written, and they were joined together with the Old Testament, which was of course codified, and we've got a Bible. So by 100 AD, we do have, in fact, the Bible that we have today in our very hands. But something happened that was kind of really cool was at 500 AD, 500 years after Christ, the language had changed to the point where Latin was now not lingua franca being went from Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, and now, of course, the Latin church wanted to have a copy in Latin, or the Roman church wanted to have a copy in Latin. So they, the church commissioned a man by the name of Jerome to translate the book, the Bible, into Latin. And the reason this is so monumental is, if you stop and think about it, it just blows your mind. Jerome took the old Latin version and some of the original tongues and translated the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, as we have it today, into Latin. That book was called the Vulgate. And Vulgate means common. So this book, from 500 to all the way through 1,000, for a full millennium, was the only Bible that the world had. You can argue with me a little bit on some of that, but I mean, that's pretty much the truth, is that for 1,000 years, it was the only Bible. And the Catholic Church was the only church. You know, up until the time of 1500, when Martin Luther came on the scene, and other reformers, of course. But I mean, it's just astounding when you stop and think of it. There was a lot of things that, if we do flip forward to 1500, Martin Luther, of course, not only was trying to not destroy the Catholic Church, he was trying to correct it. Because the church had, in that millennium, had a lot of things had happened that weren't biblical. So there was praying to the saints and the Virgin Mary, there was purgatory, there was looking at the Pope as if he were actually Christ, and when he spoke ex cathedra, he spoke with the authority of God, authority of Christ. You know, many of these things that we just could not believe had crept into the church, and so all Luther wanted to do was try to correct those things. He also did a monumental task of translating the Bible into German for the common people. Many reformers, as we'll get into soon, were killed for that, and burned at the stake for translating things from into common language. It was purported that the church's stand was, you can't let the common people read the Bible because they might misinterpret it, and if they do, they might be led astray, and if they're led astray, they might go to hell. So you can almost say, like the Catholic Church was saying, we want to make sure that the parishioners don't go to hell. We want to save them, not damn them. So it was only the Catholic Church and the priests that could, in fact, interpret it to the people, and they weren't allowed to read the Bible. They used to have the main Bible, which is not only because it was very valuable, they would have a chain to the churches. I've been there and seen some of that. It's kind of strange to see. Now, Martin Luther's time, 1500, and of course it's not just an approximation, it was mid-1500s, but 1500, we fast forward to 1611. 1611 is when the King of England, James I, commissioned a Bible translation from the original languages into English. It was monumental because not only was, just like the Vulgate was the only Bible from 500 to 1500 for 1,000 years, now we have the English translation in the 1611 King James Version, named after him, of course, King James I, King James Version, and that was actually pretty much the only Bible for Protestants for 500 years. After that, there's a lot of translations happening, and I do want to clarify the word translation and version too. A lot of people use those two terms interchangeably. Usually, a translation, if you see a Bible that says it's a translation, that means that it is translated from the original language, from Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic. And a version might be another text that is written, or a Bible that's written based on a version. It might be, somebody might take the King James Version and say, I don't like the way it looks, I think I'm just going to make it more understandable, and they base it on the King James Version. It's really a translation. But it gets confusing as far as translation and version, but that's the basic difference. And there is another classical group of Bibles that are called the paraphrase. And a paraphrase is like the New Living Bible. That's a paraphrase. So it's not a word-for-word translation from the original. It's a phrase-for-phrase translation. It's made so you can understand it, read it like you're reading the newspaper. That's not a word-for-word translation. Okay, now we're going to get into a little bit of the making of the Bible. So that's the overall timeline. And actually, if you want to say, you know what, that's the flow, you already got how the Bible came here, and you could almost stop there if you wanted to, but I'm not going to let you do that, because we've got a lot of other things to look into. My intent is to, now that we know the general flow, what dates did things really happen? What kind of manuscripts do we have that really we can say are ancient? And how do we know that? And who translated them, and what is that called? But before we even get into that, you really need to know about writing. How did these things get written? There's oral translations, of course, way before Moses, where the stories of creation stories were transferred from father to son, from mother to daughter, all the way down through history. You know, it was very important because that was there was writing, but not the type that was universal schooled writing. And so most of it was oral translations until Moses came along in 1500, as far as our Bible is concerned. But you might say, well, what were some of the methods of writing? What did they write on? They didn't have paper made with pine fibers, and you know, it was what did they actually write on? Well, it's kind of interesting. There was stone. Some of the early writings were on stone. There was a lot of mention of writing in stone. In fact, it's in that English slang where you say, you know, it's in stone. You write it in stone. There's a lot of references to writing in stone throughout the Bible. But speaking as a historian, it's very interesting that there was a famous stela, or a large stone monument that was written in 1750 by Hammurabi, and it was the Code of Hammurabi, written for all the Babylonians. And on all the sides, I've seen pictures of it, not in person, but you know, it was written that all these codes, as if you're going to say the Ten Commandments, but it was much more voluminous than that, were written on the stela. And it's one of the typical example of stone writing. And clay tablets, going way back to 8,000. And what happened is they would take a wet clay, and then they had a sharpened stick, and they would write in the wet clay, and it would make kind of wedge-shaped forms. It's called cuneiform. And they would write on wet clay and then cure it. And then that would be part of their documents. A lot of kings and the rulers would make edicts and would send out these clay tablets. I had a college professor in ancient history, Achilles Avramidis. He was from Greece, and he was telling us one day a funny story about all of these tablets, clay tablets. He went over to the Mideast to translate many of these tablets, and there was a collection of 500,000 of these clay tablets, and his project was working on translating them. He said one of the funniest things that he noticed was he was reading one and translating it, and it was an account from an accountant that was working for a businessman. And he said after he translated it, he said it was blatantly obvious that the accountant was stealing from his manager or the businessman, because you could see the numbers were all stacked. And I remember Avramidis looking at the class and he says, you know, I think that just proves that mankind has not really changed that much over time. And I can still see him today after smiling and telling us that. So that was cuneiform writing, clay tablets. You probably are familiar with the Egyptian, of course, the hieroglyphs. Those are pictograms. They're all consonants. There's no vowels. It's kind of like Hebrew. In Hebrew, there's only consonants. There's no vowels. And the words on the large print, the unicals, there's no spaces between the words, and they read from the right side to the left side. So it's already, you try to read a sentence with no vowels in our words, and it's difficult. The hieroglyphics were like that. I mean, the Egyptian texts were like that as well. Then they had wooden wax. They would actually take a smooth piece of wood and impregnate it with wax, and they would write on the wax. Next one was kind of interesting, the metal. They would actually take gold, silver, bronze, metal, thin sheets of metal, and write on them. And if you were in the Roman, if you were a Roman centurion and you served your time in the military, you would be given this small little diploma that would be in bronze, and they would write on it. If any of you have been in military, you know you get your discharge papers. Well, they would do this for the Roman centurions. They would get their discharge papers, and then with that little bronze piece of writing, it would allow them to get into Disneyland free, or it would allow them to get things and also prove their citizenship. Because sometimes if you served as a centurion and you weren't a Roman, you could still have citizenship as long as you served in the military. Ostraca. This is interesting. Those go all the way back to 3000. I look at ostraca almost like scratch paper. They would find broken pieces of shards of broken pottery, and they would take a scratcher, and they would scratch and write on those. And there's just hundreds of thousands of these that are left over for the archaeologists to look through. And papyrus, and I had some samples of papyrus. I couldn't find them, but papyrus is interesting. That started back in 3000 BC, and they actually, in Egypt, along the Nile, they have all the bulrushes, and they would cut the bulrushes and they would strip them. They have long veins in them. They'd strip them and they'd lay these crisscross them, and then they would stretch them and cut them and let them dry in the sun. And many times they would be glued end to end to make a long roll. It's interesting also, the Greek word for this papyrus is biblion, where we get our word Bible. And also papyrus, that word is where we get our word paper. So it's kind of interesting, those kind of come through it. Then the last type of writing was on leather, parchment, and vellum. You'll hear these words and you say, well, what in the world's the difference? Well, it is kind of interesting. The parchment is animal skins that they are soaked in lime, dehaired and soaked in lime and stretched and dried, whereas the leather is tanned, just like we would tan leather today. They'd use cow brains or the brains together with other chemicals to actually tan the leather and dehair it. So it just processed it slightly different. But vellum is interesting because it actually is a parchment that's made only from calf skin, from young cows. So there's three different types of products there. So you got all kinds of different kind of writing. So there were some people have doubted that the Bible was, did they even know how to write back then? Well, of course you have to stop and think Moses was raised in the Egyptian court and he knew how to write. We'll look at some ancient manuscripts that were written around the time of Moses that were written around Sinai, Mount Sinai. I mean, there's all kinds of evidence for writing. Of course these things could have been written, and they are ancient and we can prove that. Some of the earliest copies of the Bible are written as a book. And you'll hear the term codex a lot. And codex is actually, whenever you hear the word codex, just think a book. What happened was these large scrolls of either papyrus or of leather that may be up to 35 feet long, rolled up with the writing on them, got to be very heavy and very clumsy. And so the genius came up with the idea, well, let's cut these into pieces, usually about 17 inch by 17 inch, and then we'll fold them and then make them into a codex or a book. So the whole book industry, really, the concept of books is really attributed to Christians around the time of Christ when they were trying to transport these and use them as messages sent from church to church. So we've got all the Christian stories, the Gospels were written by people wanting to preserve the story of Christ because, of course, if Christ, when he died and rose, and he was 33 when he died and rose, and then we started to have people that witnessed all this dying, they said, we should probably document because they were waiting for his return with an unknown date of return. And as the older generation started dying off, they said, we got to make sure we write these stories down, and pass them on to our children. And so the Gospels, of course, were written. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written to pass on the stories, unique stories about our salvation in Christ and his life, death, and resurrection. We also had Paul, who was writing his pastoral letters to all of the churches, and those were kept and treasured. And then you had Peter, James, John, Jude. John wrote his book Revelation, and so these were all being accumulated and written. And one bit about writing, you might say, well, who was it that was actually doing the writing? All these letters are being written, and did somebody just have a typewriter or whip out their pen and start writing it? There was usually a term called scribes, these people who were trained and knowledgeable in writing. And the scribes, their tools of their trade were, they would have a reed, and then it was a split in the end to hold the ink. The ink was usually made out of soot, or kind of carbon black soot mixed together with gum, tree gum, and water for consistency and make the ink. They would have a pumice stone that they would use to rub across the surface of the papyrus and or the vellum or the parchment to smooth it out, because a lot of times where the hair was at in the animals or the crisscross of the lines of the bulrushes would be kind of uneven. So they would pumice it so it was smooth. And they always have a ruler, because they would scribe across on the line. So that then they, very lightly, and you can see it on the codexes, then they would know where they're writing in a line. Because it's very important you know that when you're writing, that they wanted to have the same number of words in a line, so the one below it would have the same number of letters, same number of letters, same number of letters, same number of letters. So everything was all lined up. That was the way they wrote then. The scribes, after they finished, would often write at the bottom of the manuscript, they wrote their name, the place that they wrote it at, and the date. So you'll often see that at the bottom of these manuscripts. So we're going to get into the manuscripts now. So where are they at? Who mysteriously gathered them together? And how old are they? Or are they old enough to be looked at as far back as possible, so that they're in fact legitimate, they're authentic, that they weren't tapped and tampered with. So the start of the New Testament, as I mentioned, by 45 or 50 AD, a lot of the books had been written, up to about 100. But the last book that was written in the New Testament was the book of Acts. Was the book of Revelation. So John wrote that about 100 AD. So between 45 and 100, all the books were written. The earliest manuscripts were written, the earliest, and probably the ones that we feel we can trust the most, since they're the oldest, nearest to the time of Christ, were written in unicals. And if you look at your handout, there's an example of unicals. Unicals are all capital letters. They're the oldest ones. All the Greek was written in capital letters. And they're written right on the Greek, they're written left to right, like we write. Hebrew is right to left. But the Greek, as we did, left to right. And so the unicals were the large ones. There was also another example there of what's called minuscules. The unicals, the oldest ones, are written from up to 800 AD, and then after 800 is when minuscules started. That's more like cursive. It became smaller letters, and there's spaces between the words. But the unicals, as I said, are all capital letters, and they're all together with no punctuation, and that's a little bit tough to do. Let's see. Are we supposed to be ending now, I bet? Well, let me at least cover this real quick. So, the oldest copies of the New and Old Testament that we have all together as a Bible are found in 3 manuscripts. Manuscript, again, the definition is manuscript has to be a book in the original language, and the three that we have that are the cherished things of the entire church are Vatican. Let's see if I got that here. Or the Vatican manuscript. Vatican manuscript was written about 300 AD. It was found in the Vatican Library in 1841, but never revealed to the world until the mid-1800s. So it was there the whole time. It was written about 300, and it's written on vellum, and it's a codex. It's a book, bound, beautifully written, and there's a copy of a page in there from the Vatican manuscript. And then the Sinaitic manuscript was written in 325. It's found in the St. Catherine Monastery in Mount Sinai. The stories of how these were found are like a mystery story. I could spend a whole day talking about just the Sinaitic manuscript. It's an unbelievable story of being found in the trash and used to start fires. And the guy who went there and broke the law trying to save them. Oh, it's an amazing story. But that was originally written in 325, and then the Alexandrian manuscript, I have it wrong on there and maybe in your handouts. It wasn't written in 95, it was written in 400 AD. It's again unicals. And it's interesting that particular copy, the Alexandrian, contains not only the New and Old Testament, it includes additional books. It includes the first and second book of Clement, as well as some sermons from St. Clement. And it's the only copies that we have of the Bible that had added in Clement. Clement lived about 95 AD, is when he lived. But they're interesting books. They're neat to read. But there's rules that we're going to talk about as to why certain books were canonized and other ones weren't. Because there's a whole bunch of books that were written between 300 years before Christ up until about 100 years after Christ. They were written and are called apocryphal books. And the Catholics have 15 additional books in their Bible than we do, and they are the apocryphal books. And they consider them canonical, that they're not just worthy of, Lutherans would call them worthy of study, but they would consider them, in fact, part of Scripture that were, in fact, canonized. Quite a bit different than us. When are we supposed to be done at 10:30? Is that? Okay, so I guess I better quit. So next time we'll cover some other older versions, get into the Old Testament stuff, and then we're going to talk about the new version, a new revision of the Bible that I helped work on. It's kind of an interesting story. So